Lean, hair tan, cold iron collar, under the mud we crawl. Heavy, the clock stopped ticking now. Silence, buried deep under the frost.
In the year 874 AD, on a coastline no European had ever mapped, a Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarsson performed one of the strangest acts of navigation in the history of human exploration. He threw two carved wooden pillars, the high seat pillars from his own home in Norway, sacred objects that represented the authority and identity of his household, into the open North Atlantic Ocean, and told his crew to sail in whatever direction the current carried them. Not toward a known destination, not following a star or a coastline, toward whatever the sea decided. This was not recklessness, this was theology. For the Norse, the gods spoke through the natural world, and the ocean was their most direct messenger. Wherever those pillars landed, that was where Odin intended him to build. The pillars drifted for 3 years before Ingolfur's scouts finally found them washed ashore on a peninsula of black volcanic rock on the southwestern coast of an island so remote, so geologically violent, so fundamentally inhospitable to human life that every rational instinct in a reasonable man's body would have told him to turn around and go home. Instead, Ingolfur Arnarsson unloaded his ship, drove his cattle onto the lava fields, looked at the columns of steam rising from the earth like the exhalations of something ancient and subterranean, and named the place Reykjavik, Smoking Bay. And on that alien shore, at the edge of the known world, surrounded by glaciers and geysers and the permanent roar of the North Atlantic, one of the most improbable and consequential experiments in the history of human civilization began. What unfolded on this island over the following 11 centuries is a story that has no right to exist. Iceland has no strategic location. It controls no vital trade routes. It sits in the middle of one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth, directly in the path of Arctic storms, periodically convulsed by volcanic eruptions powerful enough to alter the climate of the entire northern hemisphere. It has no native trees large enough to build with, no indigenous population to absorb or displace, no gold, no spices, no silk. By every calculation that has ever governed the rise and fall of civilizations, Iceland should be a footnote, a brief, failed experiment in Viking stubbornness, abandoned after the first catastrophic winter and forgotten by everyone except a few specialists in Norse archaeology. Instead, it produced the world's oldest functioning parliament. It produced the literary tradition that preserved everything we know about the Norse gods. It produced the first European explorers to set foot in North America 5 centuries before Columbus. It survived the Black Death, volcanic apocalypse, centuries of colonial rule, and the complete destruction of its modern economy. And it did all of this with a population that, at its lowest point, barely exceeded 30,000 souls, fewer people than live in a mid-sized American suburb. To understand how any of this was possible, you have to understand the world that produced the people who settled Iceland. You have to understand Norway in the 9th century, and specifically, you have to understand what it meant to be a free man in a Norse society that was, for the first time in its history, running out of room. Scandinavia in the 800s was not a unified, peaceful region of modern imagination. It was a fractured landscape of competing chieftaincies, blood feuds, and constantly shifting power alliances, governed entirely by local authority structures and the ancient principle that a man's worth was measured by his land, his weapons, his lineage, and his absolute refusal to submit to anyone he had personally chosen to follow. This was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was a survival strategy encoded over centuries into the cultural DNA of a people who lived in an environment where weakness was fatal and dependence on distant authority was simply not an option. A Norse chieftain who surrendered his independence did not merely lose political status, he lost everything that defined him as a man worth knowing. Into this world came Harald Fairhair. The sagas describe him as tall, magnificently bearded, and possessed of a will so absolute that he reportedly swore not to cut his hair until he had united all of Norway under his rule, a vow that gave him his nickname and, eventually, after years of brutal military campaigning, his kingdom. By the 870s and 880s, Harald was systematically absorbing the smaller coastal chieftaincies of Norway, offering their leaders a choice between submission and exile that contained, in practice, very little choice at all. For the great families who had held their land and their independence for generations, submission to Harald was not a compromise, it was an annihilation of identity. And so, in one of the most consequential mass migrations of the early medieval period, thousands of Norwegian families, the most independent, the most proud, the most temperamentally unsuited to bowing before any central authority, loaded everything they owned onto longships and sailed west into the unknown. Some went to the Orkney Islands, some went to the Shetlands, some went to the northwestern coast of Scotland and the northern shores of Ireland, where Norse settlers were already building the trading towns that would eventually become Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford. And the most extreme, the most unyielding, the ones for whom even the Orkney Islands felt too close to the reach of a Norwegian king, they went all the way to Iceland. They were not going to paradise. They knew from the reports of the handful of Norse sailors who had stumbled on the island in the preceding decades exactly what Iceland was. The first confirmed Norse sighting came around 860 AD, when a Viking named Naddodr was blown off course while sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands and found himself looking at an enormous, snow-covered landmass he had never seen on any sailing direction. He went ashore briefly, climbed a mountain to look for signs of inhabitation, found none, and sailed away, naming the place Snaeland, land of snow, with the kind of bleak accuracy that suggests he had no particular desire to return. Several years later, a Swedish Viking named Gardar Svarvason became the first man known to have deliberately circumnavigated the island, sailing its entire coastline and spending a full winter at a place on the northern coast he named Husavik, Bay of Houses, after the temporary shelters his crew built there. Gardar returned to Scandinavia with a positive report, calling the island Gardar's Home, Gardar's Isle, with the slightly self-aggrandizing spirit common to men who consider themselves discoverers. Then came Floki Vilgerdason, a Norwegian farmer and sailor who organized the first deliberate attempt at settlement, bringing livestock and supplies, and a plan. The plan collapsed. Floki was so absorbed in the extraordinary fishing of Iceland's coastal waters that he and his crew failed to store sufficient hay for the winter, and when the cold descended in full force, all of his livestock died. He spent the winter in misery, watched the sea ice pile up along the northern fjords, renamed the island Iceland in a spirit that mixed accurate meteorological observation with considerable personal bitterness, and sailed home to Norway to tell everyone the place was worthless. He later changed his assessment and reportedly returned to Iceland to settle permanently in what may be the earliest recorded instance of a man who complained endlessly about a place and then moved there anyway. Despite Floki's warnings, the settlers came. They came because Harald Fairhair had left them no comfortable alternative, and because the Norse relationship with danger was fundamentally different from the relationship most people in the modern world maintain with risk. These were people whose religions celebrated death in battle as the highest possible human achievement, whose mythology was built around the certainty of cosmic catastrophe, the Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, and whose poetry treated hardship as the medium through which character was revealed rather than destroyed. An island that was difficult was not a deterrent, it was, in a meaningful sense, an attraction. Between 874 and 930, in just 56 years, approximately 400 families settled Iceland, a migration so rapid and so complete that by the time the last available farmland had been claimed, virtually every habitable valley and coastal plain on the island had been occupied.
The Landnama book, the Book of Settlements, compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries from earlier oral and written sources, records the names of approximately 400 original settlers with a genealogical and geographical specificity that borders on obsessive. Who claimed which land, who disputed which boundary, who was related to whom, and which of the original settlers had come directly from Norway versus which had spent time in the Norse colonies of the British Isles and brought Celtic thralls, slaves, with them. Modern genetic analysis of the Icelandic population confirms what the Landnama book suggests. The founding population was predominantly Norwegian in its male lineage, but significantly Celtic, Scottish, and Irish in its female lineage, a pattern that reflects the common Norse practice of raiding the British Isles for female slaves who were then integrated into Norse households as concubines and eventually wives. The island that was built on the principle of freedom was built, in part, by people who had none. Into this world came 10,000 people, spread across an island roughly the size of Kentucky, speaking a common language, sharing a common religion and legal tradition, but owing allegiance to no central authority whatsoever. This was, for the first generation of settlers, a political anomaly so extreme it barely had a name. There was no king, there were no bishops, there was no standing army, no professional judiciary.